Hello, my name is Wildstag, and thank you for tuning in to another used book rant. Today I'm going to do a follow-up to last week's video and discuss The Living Dead, part of the D&D Iconics series from 3rd edition. This one features Mia Lee, the wizard, very prominently on the cover. And once again, T.H. Lane is a pseudonym for a batch of authors. The art, from what I understand, the cover art is by Todd Lockwood, whose art is right there. And he did a lot of prominent Magic the Gathering and D&D art back in the day. This book is allegedly a story of second level adventurers. The characters involved are 4 main characters, 3 of whom are iconic characters, one of whom is a tertiary character, and then one of them is a halfling rogue that fits the race and class of Lita, but serves a very different role within the narrative. Instead of being a thief with a heart of gold like Lita, this one is a hardened bandit who basically, he does have a heart of gold. I think that is a characteristic trait that D&D, especially Wizards of the Coast, write into their rogues, that these rogues live hard lives, they have learned to be cutthroat, but they do have a heart of gold. A lot of those characters tend to be written that way. So that character, kind of like the one I mentioned in Oath of Nerul, the named non-iconic characters are prone to dying in these adventures. But the iconic characters do not. Now, the story opens with Mia Lee waiting for her master, the one who taught her wizardry, and she's waiting at an inn. And there's this old lady dispensing this prophecy about a young male musician and a female elf. And Mia Lee tries to shrug it off. Now, narratively, this is like the call to action. Mia Lee is shrugging it off because she is there waiting for her master. And she ends up spending some time throughout the evening. The half-elf bard Devis shows up, and one of the things I do like about this series is that it brings some personality to the characters that you don't see in the pictures accompanying the class. So there is a bit of a joke that Regdar tends to die, and a lot of the art shows him being healed by some character, being rescued by some party member, that Mia Lee always happens to be the poster child for various caster prestige classes that she has no business really entering somehow. Lita is often shown as interacting with magic but barely skating by. The Use Magic Device art shows Lita trying out a wand, and it has clearly exploded in her face. So there are, bits of personality in the art, but it doesn't really do the characters justice like these books do. So this here is the art for Devis. And concept art I've seen on Todd Lockwood's site shows that Devis would be someone playing a lute, but he has a rapier hidden in the spine of that lute, which is a cool detail. I think incredibly impractical. I don't think that's how anything works. But if there's a historical example of a lute with a hidden dagger inside of it, that's really cool, and it helps to support the idea of Devis. In this book, we also have Mia Lee, like I mentioned, and Mia Lee is this, it's basically the same art, but she is the iconic wizard of 3rd edition. And lastly, the third iconic in this book is Soveliss, and that is this Elven Ranger. Soveliss the Elven Ranger shows up in this story, and I think of the 3 iconics, his is the most interesting backstory as presented in this book, but Mia Lee is the most interesting personification of these characters. Devis is a very stereotypically chaotic good bard. He does what he does. He opposes law. When they end up getting imprisoned unjustly, he breaks out. So Devis is an interesting character, but he's kind of one note. Mia Lee is interesting because it describes her in very fun ways you wouldn't necessarily think of with a wizard. She's kind of plain as far as wizards go, except for the fact that she has an inability to handle alcohol and a fondness for musicians, which results in the early chapters, her going to bed with Devis after they spend their time drinking and him playing music. She wakes up and basically treats it like a one-night stand, says, "Look, your clothes are over there, get your things and go." He's the one that is taken prisoner for some reason. I don't think she is. But the whole, like, taken prisoner subplot doesn't really have a significant bearing on the story. This group ends up being accompanied by Devis and Mia Lee end up accompanied by this gnome cleric of Corellon Lorethian. And Corellon is the patron deity of elves and generally only gives spells to elven followers. And it's a big question of why is this gnome a priest of Corellon? Why was she humored or whatever? But the echelons of this sect of Corellon have departed to a city nearby upon request, and the only one left behind is this gnome who leads Mia Lee and the halfling rogue and Devis to an armory where each of them ends up armored and armed for the journey ahead. That's partly one of the things I don't like. They're basically given a bunch of like stuff for wealth by level, basically, all at once. What's interesting is that the undead are the main enemy of this book. And that's fair, that's fine for a level 2 adventure. And in the early portion of the book, it makes sense. But later in the book, we get Mia Lee and Devis and this rogue and the gnome are running as fast as they can to get to this city that is overrun and destroyed by undead, and they're fighting a Wight. Normally, a Wight is a difficult encounter for a band of adventurers of level 2. So yeah, normally a Wight would be a reasonable encounter. A CR3 for 4 level 2 characters, that's something you can handle. But the villain, whose name is Kavadrek, is a intelligent Wight that retains its casting from when it was alive 1,000 years ago. It had been sealed all this time and is effectively a high-level wizard in a Wight's body. And that doesn't really make sense as a villain for a level 2 party. So Kavadrek ends up killing Mia Lee on their way to this elven city that is overrun by undead. And the only remaining elves are taking shelter in the chapel to Corellon Lorethian, where this gnome reveals herself to be this ancient 1,200-year-old elven priestess who is given the power to survive just long enough to defeat Kavadrek. And she uses her magic to aid everyone there. Soveliss had been the one early on to deliver a message to Mia Lee, and so this party, ranger, a cleric, rogue, wizard, bard, is a pretty well balanced party. Soveliss, according to Mia Lee, when she was doing Detect Magic, she felt that he had been turned to flesh and thought that he was perhaps a statue that had been given form, animated, and then given a fleshy form. What it later turns out is that, according to this gnome, now elven priestess of Corellon Lorethian, Soveliss is 1,100 years old, almost as old as she is, and he, as a ranger, had given his life to be turned into a statue through the spell Flesh to Stone, and would stand guard as a ward against the villain Cavadrek's machinations. But that ward failed because humans and halflings ended up digging a hole into the sealed area, and now undead were getting out. And so it was necessary that Mia Lee's master, who was a member of the same party as the villain and this priestess, this party of 2 wizards and a cleric, now ancient enemies, Soveliss is turned from stone back to flesh, born a normal elf, turned to stone to guard a tomb, turned back to elf in time to protect his grandchildren and his son from these undead. And so it makes sense, ranger, this is a perfect adventure for a ranger, assuming all the undead are of an appropriate level, but they're not. So like I said earlier, Mia Lee was killed by Cavadrek, the villain, but she's brought back, which is way too powerful a spell for level 2 characters. And it completely ignores the fact that she would have a negative level that would put her effectively at level 1 for a long time until she got that rest. And so they use the word resurrection in the book, but resurrection is a 7th level spell. Raise Dead maybe could work as the spell that was used, but it just doesn't work. The scope of the adventure is way too big for level 2 adventurers to have an impact on this villain. And that's the thing I didn't like about The Living Dead. The personalities, the character interactions, those were good, but the adventure itself was too big, too high a stake for level 2 characters. Like I said in the last video, the Savage Caves, Oath of Neural, these are adventures that seem fitting for characters of 1st and 3rd level. But The Living Dead doesn't do that. It's almost like they weren't given guidelines, but were told write for 2nd level characters, and they were allowed to write whatever they wanted. It felt like a classic mass market paperback fantasy story rather than something trying to live within the Dungeons and Dragons rule set. So I didn't like The Living Dead. I did this first video, the Savage Caves, first of the series, and then I did the 3rd of the series, which was Oath of Neural. I'm jumping back to the 2nd to explain why I didn't like it and why I mentioned it in the last video as not necessarily being as good as Oath of Neural. And so that's my feeling. Like I said on the last one, I only paid $3 for this, and it was worth it, the money I spent, but it doesn't do what it sets out to do, or at least it doesn't do what the others set out to do. So it's an alright 180-page story, but it doesn't do, for me, what the others in this series did. So that's The Living Dead. If you ever find these books, check them out, read them. They're fun enough. They're really quick reads. I read each. It took about 3 days per book. So this is a fun series. So yeah, my name is Wildstag, and thank you for tuning in to another used book rant.